Good evening. Welcome to the Community Task Force on Policing's Subcommittee on the Civilian Review Board from Elgin, Illinois. I'm Larry Schooler, one of the members of the facilitation team, and I'm joined tonight by the members of that subcommittee, including Chair LaJewel Krigler, Task Force Member Denise Haben, Task Force Member Corey Battles, Task Force Member Shimon Blanchard, joining us from City Hall, Co-Chair Ishmael Cordova, EPD Chief Lally, City Council Member Tish Powell, and one of our facilitation teammates, Sheila Brown. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I look forward to our conversation tonight, which will include a conversation with Peer City in Aurora to discuss their experience with the Civilian Review Board. But before we go any further, I wanted to take a quick look at our agenda for the evening. We are going to check in just a minute to see if we have any members of the public wishing to comment and address the task force. We will then probably turn to Chief Lally for some brief updates if she has them. And then I will go through our prior discussions last week and walk through a discussion of roles and responsibilities for the Civilian Review Board here in Elgin. At 7 o'clock, we may take a short break, and then at 7 o'clock, we will be hearing just from Aurora. We actually were unable to secure attendance from a second Civilian Review Board. We might be able to be in touch with them offline, but there were not representatives available. But we will hear from a member of the Aurora Civilian Review Board and be able to then ask that person some questions, pick their brains a little bit, and then we will reflect on that discussion and discuss next steps. So we certainly will end by 8 o'clock. We might end a little bit earlier, but the goal tonight is to get through as much of the remaining parts of the initial proposal put forward by Councilmember Powell as we can, as well as the task force comments we had received a couple of months ago when this was first presented, and then to discuss things with Aurora in the second hour. All right, so we'll turn to Task Force Member Blanchard and see if there is anyone at City Hall that wants to address this body.
No one is present.
Thank you. I want to make the public aware, especially if you're watching us tonight, that we are in the process of planning a series of community conversations where the general public, anyone, will have the opportunity to participate either in a fully large public meeting or perhaps a small group discussion. And we want you to stay tuned to the website that we have for this body, which is City of Elgin. What have I done with my website? Here we go. cityofelgin.org/task force, which is where you can find all the information about the Community Task Force on Policing. But we hope to be announcing some community engagement opportunities sometimes within the next couple of weeks that would take place towards the middle and end of February. So please be advised that even if you can't get to City Hall and comment during task force meetings or subcommittee meetings, we will have some standalone opportunities for the public to comment coming up in the relatively near future. So stay tuned for that. All right, Chief, always good to have you. Thank you for coming back. And also for being, it looks like a fellow Apple Watch user, if I'm not mistaken, Chief. I didn't realize we had that in common. Chief, this is mine, by the way, it's blue. Chief, you did an incredibly thorough presentation to us last week on disciplinary measures, and so we weren't anticipating any kind of significant presentation from you this week, but I know we had discussed perhaps having the racial makeup of external complaints, and I wondered if you were able to compile that data.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. So the subcommittee had asked for that information about the external complaint data as far as with the race and sex. So I went back 3 years, so 2019, 2020, and 2021, which I thought was appropriate and for the relevancy. We can go back further, but this was what we could do within the short period of time. So during 2019 through 2021, there were a total of 40 external complaints. So if you remember from my presentation last week, the external complaints are where a citizen generates that complaint. So those are not the ones that are generated throughout the department. So 2019, 20 and 21, a total of 40. Of those 40 complaints, and I'll give you the percentage, 58% of those complaints were made by an African-American. A Hispanic is 16%, 25% white, and then 3% is unknown because the complaint was anonymous. So we have no idea who it is. So those are the percentages of the total complaints. Number wise, just to put it in perspective, instead of percentages, 23 of the 40 were from a person who was Black. 6 was a person who was Hispanic. 10, a person who was white. And then 1, it was the unknown, the anonymous. So that's the past 3 years. That's the racial breakdown. And then those complaints, they range anywhere from rudeness to conduct to unlawful stops to neglect of duty. The ones that we could say had some type of racial component or racial profiling component. And again, these sometimes the complaints are complex. There's a couple things, but the ones that we could say, looking back, and again, this was a very cursory review, probably a total of, I think 6 of those complaints had some type of racial profiling component. So 6 of the 40. And like I said, the other ones there, rudeness, conduct, driving, the way an officer was driving. Some are false arrests. So people are arrested and they make a complaint that they shouldn't have been arrested. Some were about use of force, but 6 that I could probably say with certainty had some type of racial profiling component. So that was the data that the task force had asked for. And again, I looked at the past 3 years. If the task force wanted more, that would take me a little bit more time.
No problem. Can you just, I want to just check an assumption of mine, Chief, that when we say it had a racial profiling component, we mean that the complaint was that I was treated differently in a discriminatory way because of my racial identity. Is that what it means?
Yeah, I mean, that's there. Each one is different. It could be because I was stopped because, of my racial makeup, or I was not given a certain or appropriate service, where they're saying it's because of their race. So some of these are, their rudeness or conduct. They're not talking about their race. They're just saying the officer was rude. It had nothing to do with, they just felt their behavior was rude or their conduct. But some of them, like I said, there's a driving complaint where someone complained about an officer driving. Some of them are, neglect of duty, that they didn't write a complete report. But the 6 had some type of, I believe that this happened because of this.
And I just want to underscore what you said, which is that we're talking about a total of, it looks like, did you say 40 over the 3 years? Is that what I'm
40
looking at here?
Yes,
Okay.
40. So 40 total, 2019, 2020, and 2021.
Very good. You didn't have data, Chief, on the ones that were internally reported, did you, in terms of any racial component or racial profiling? Anything?
No, I could just say off the top of my head, the ones that are internally generated are not dealing with any race. It's conduct, it's behavior, it's nothing that's ringing a bell off the top of my head. I didn't look at the internal.
No problem. Corey Battles, go ahead.
Chief, can I ask you, how was those findings? Like, what was founded on those findings?
Yes. So if you guys, I can get that to you guys next week. We meet next week, right? So I can get that for you guys next week.
Okay.
If, because I'd have to go through each one and look at the disposition. So I'll get that for you next week.
Thanks.
Some of them I know were exonerated, some were unfounded, but I want to make sure I give you guys the right data.
All right.
Good question. Task Force Member Haven.
I lost my question. So, and can you also get the data by year? So that X number were in 2019, X number were in 2020, X number were in 2021. And then again, the disposition of those.
Yes, I will get that for you guys next week.
Okay.
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Other questions for the chief? And beyond just questions for her, reflections on, if any, on what you just heard.
Chief, this is Councilwoman Powell. Can you repeat, what was the total number, the percentage of those 40% of the complaints that were made by African Americans?
So out of the 40 total complaints external, 23 were from the complainant who was Black. So that would be 58% of the total complaints.
Okay, thanks. That's what I was.
You're welcome.
And
Go ahead.
And I would really be interested in the same kind of comparison for the internal complaints. And I'm trying to figure out like how to articulate this. Because even though, and you've described the complaints as conduct, it would be interesting, I would find it interesting to know the demographic breakdown of those conduct complaints to see if it's across the board as reflected by the police department, you know, as reflecting the demographics of the police department. Is that possible, Chief?
Yeah, so actually the 2021 data on who the officer, the race and sex of the officer would be on our transparency site. So we started that in 2021. But for 19 and 20, I have to go back and get that. So 2021 is public, but I'll get 19 and 20 for you guys for next week.
Okay.
That's what you're asking, right? You're asking for the race and sex of the officer who was involved in the internal complaint.
Yes, and the person who made the complaint.
So for the internal complaints, those are generated. So that could be the supervisor, but that there's a vetting process. So it's not like a sergeant can't just open up an ROI, right? Okay. So it has to go through the process. It goes through their lieutenant to their commander, eventually to the chief, the deputy chief, and to me.
Okay.
So we make sure that there's some type of violation, something there to open an investigation.
Right. Okay. So I'll take whatever data you can give me.
Got it. Okay.
The kitchen sink.
Quick question.
Yes,
sorry. Sir. Denise, I thought maybe I was wrong, but I thought Denise was saying like for the internal, what was their race? So like if I worked there and wasn't Black or white and I'm a complainant, that's what I took it as. I might be wrong.
So, yeah, I was actually asking for both, for you know, for the complainant and for the person,
and the target of the complaint.
Right.
Yeah, so ultimately, so I mean, for the officers, the subject of the complaint when they're internally generated, you know, I can get that data for you. And like I said, 2021 is already on the transparency site, but for internally, the person who starts the complaint, ultimately it's me. I mean, so because it has to go to the chain before an internal started. So, you know, in the end, I'm the person that says, yes, we're going to start an investigation, if that makes sense. So,
yeah.
Okay.
So it might come back as white or, you know, for the complainants, but right. But there could be an originating officer that made it, or originating staff person before the chief.
Right.
Correct, but ultimately for the any complaint, it eventually has to make its way up the chain of command so that we know that there's you know, there's a vetting process to ensure that we're, you know, there's policy violations, there's something there to investigate.
Okay.
Co-Chair Cordova and then Chair Crickler.
All right. Hi, Chief Lally. This is Ishmael. One, I want to thank you for providing that information to us in the last meeting. I've been watching every meeting, so I feel like most of the time I'm sitting in one of your criminal justice classes listening to so thank you for providing that information and being so thorough with the detail. So I have two primary questions. The first question is, when we're referring to these police officers, are we only talking about the ones that are on the streets, like in those beats, or are we also incorporating police officers that are stationed in our schools in U46?
It's officers in totality. So
All right.
everything that the complaint data and information that I give you is everything. It spans sworn officers who are in schools, who are in investigations, who are on patrol, and even our non-sworn personnel, as I mentioned last week too.
Okay, awesome. I just wanted to be sure that I understood what we're specifically talking about. And second, I know that we're going to be asking a lot of data from you, but I think that this is probably relevant to how it goes. I was wondering if you could split up the reports by quarters, so like throughout the season, throughout like January to March, for example, and if we can correlate that with the reported interactions of that quarter. So for example, how many stops, how many blah, 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 because I want to see if there's a trend with the more interactions, the more complaints, or how it really works throughout the year, at least for the 3 years that we're talking about, if that's possible.
Yes, are you looking for just external complaints, or are you looking for, pardon me?
Just external.
Just external. Okay, yes, then that's manageable. Yes, we could do that.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Chair Krigler.
Okay, I don't know if this was clarified that I think what I'm wanting to get the sex, I believe, in regards to externally, those who are stopping the Black males. I want to know what their sex is. And I think also I'm pretty much wanting to know if there's a possibility to know what has been like their time, if possible, that they've been on the force.
So Chair, I want to make sure I understand. Are you referring to all stops, all interactions?
Yeah, and regarding especially to this 58% that was stopped in regards to the Black males that are filing these complaints. I want to know those officers that actually stopped them. I want to know what was their race in regard and their sex. But then I also want to know pretty much of what, how much time have they been a police officer?
Okay, so with that,
If that's
not
possible.
out of the 40, there's 23. So those 23 complaints where the complainant was a Black person, 16 were males and 7 were females. Not all of those were traffic stops.
Mhm.
So there might have been something else that started that contact. So I could probably break it down a little bit for you to say, out of these 23, X number were related to a traffic stop, X number were, a call for service, because not all of them are traffic stops.
Mhm.
But I think, Chief, Chair Krigler, let me make sure. I think what you're asking is, we know the race of the person who filed the complaint and was engaged by the officer. You're saying, I want to know about the race, sex, and tenure length of the officer who was
Yes.
complained about.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah,
Chief,
no,
is that data,
No,
is that available?
I understood
Okay.
that, Larry.
Okay, okay.
I wanted her to know that not all of them were traffic stops.
Oh,
So I just
okay,
wanted to
okay.
let you know that, but I will get you the race of the
Well,
officer. Yes.
Whatever the incident was in
Yes.
reference to the complaints, that's
Yep.
what I want to know.
I understand. Yep, I got it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Before I turn to anybody else, Councilmember Powell, you've relocated.
I can't.
I was understanding it's about 5 degrees in the city of Elgin, and it looks a lot warmer where you are. But
It's just wishful thinking.
Task Force Member Haben, did you have anything? Yeah, I saw a hand a minute ago.
It was the same question that Kelly asked. It was about.
The question was asked. Okay.
If
All
I
right.
could though, just for
Go ahead.
clarification, and this is kind of going back to some of the other questions I believe that Chair Krigler and some of the other task force members had asked in regards to the internal complaints. Yes, we understand that a lot of those are generated by either yourself as the chief or some of the other supervising officers. I think what they were getting at is who are the subjects of the complaints? What are the demographics of the subject of the complaints? Is that, am I understanding? I couldn't remember who asked that question, but I think,
It was
Chair
someone.
Crickler. Yeah.
okay.
Or well, both Denise and Jewel had some version of that
Yes.
question. I think the chief's got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that we could get that information. Thank you.
And, I mean, I think it should also not go without saying that the work of collecting all of this data, not just to report it to us, but to track it generally is not easy. And just being able to ask the chief for the data and knowing that she can pull it is really useful. So not just thank you for coming to the meetings and reporting to us, but thanks for keeping track of the data to begin with. That makes it a lot easier. All right. Any additional questions for the chief on these numbers? Well, Chief, as usual, thank you very much. I want to just spend the time we have before our visitor from Aurora arrives, walking through both what we've discussed so far and what we have yet to come to some resolution on. And so to do that, I'm going to turn to my notes. They technically are the excellent handiwork of Sheila Brown, whom I work with on the facilitation team. So we certainly talked about the makeup of the Civilian Review Board. We discussed having no more than 2 consecutive 3-year terms. We discussed having a body somewhere in the 7 to 9 number range with a preference for an odd number of members so that tie votes could be broken. There was also discussion about having folks with a representation from communities with the highest amount of interaction with the police and linking that to data. We didn't necessarily want any kind of district by district representation, but just wanted to make sure that no particular district had a disproportionate amount of influence on the board, that all different parts of the city were represented. Several folks mentioned a desire to see specific seats for African Americans, that the board be inclusive of all genders, include young adults, could potentially include a member of the clergy. And there was some discussion, but not consensus, on whether having an attorney on the subcommittee, on the Civilian Review Board was worth formally recommending. Chair Krigler, go ahead.
I thought there wasn't a total consensus in regarding to the clergy as well.
That's correct. That's correct. I meant to say so.
Okay, because I seen the possible and I was like, I thought the attorney.
Yeah,
and
that's correct. Both the clergy suggestion and the attorney suggestion did not have committee consensus.
Correct. Thank you.
So last week, of course, we then got a great presentation from the chief, which all of you should have access to. She went through the entirety of the process of how investigations are handled now. But what I want to draw your attention to is the question that I put to her, which was her recommendation on how the Civilian Review Board in Elgin could best integrate with the current system. And so essentially the Civilian Review Board, and Chief, please, of course, correct me, you would be making a preliminary recommendation about how a complaint made by a civilian should be treated. It would then go to the Civilian Review Board and they could make a recommendation. No. Okay. glad I've got you here.
So the one that we had talked about and had some discussions about, it's the opposite. So basically,
Civilian Review Board first.
Yeah, so they would, be provided the information, but again, the anonymity of, they don't know who the officer is, they don't know who the complainant is. Here's the facts of the case, basically. And then based upon that information, make a recommendation to me. Then I make my final recommendation. And if there was some type of, there's a difference in what I recommend, whether it's more or less than what the Civilian Review Board, then I would have to report back to them and give an explanation as to why my decision was what it is. So in the end, I make the final decision, but
Right.
if there's some, something that is not the same, then I have to go back and report.
and we'll discuss here later on, the nature of what civilian review board, what this group thinks the civilian review board should have as options and so forth. But what you're saying is bring the complaint to the civilian review board, get their recommendation, and then you can either heed it in its entirety and then we move on, or if you have a difference in what you decide from them, you go back and explain your decision to the civilian review board. And I think one thing we also discussed last week was the idea that on the one hand, it might seem, for some helpful if civilians had the final say, but that opens up those civilians to liability. They could be potentially sued by the officer who is disciplined individually. And so the city doesn't want to create that risk, I don't think. And so that's why the final decision would rest at the chief in her official capacity. But the collaboration would be fairly ongoing or close in the sense that you'd be looking at the same set of facts that the civilian review board would be looking at in your reviews. So there were a lot of questions as it relates to some of what the chief presented, but I think we will, that's suffices for the summary from last week. So as I said, we had discussions around the term duration, the number of members, the composition of the board and so forth. And then we talked with the chief about the current process and how the civilian review board would play a new role in performing a review before the chief issues her final decision. And if it's consistent with the civilian review board, it would just be closed. And if it isn't, the chief would meet with the civilian review board to explain. So what I'm going to suggest we do next is turn back to the PowerPoint presentation that was prepared by Councilmember Powell, which essentially we have covered part of, but not all of. So this is the piece that we've already talked about, essentially the notion of the composition. I want to, and we also talked about the selection and appointment. Let me touch upon this for just a minute, and Councilmember Powell, obviously, as I'm going through this, feel free to interject anything. But there were, and I know Corey Battles was involved in this as well, but there were some requirements recommended for the members of the Civilian Review Board that they can't be a city employee or have any sort of current or former official affiliation with a law enforcement agency. Councilmember, does that mean that if I have been an officer somewhere else, then even if I'm retired, I wouldn't be eligible to serve on the Elgin Civilian Review Board? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Muted. Sorry, muted. That was the initial thought, based on just wanting to give normal everyday citizens the ability to look at these cases at their level versus having someone influence the board to have them look at it from the police perspective, because we have that already. So this was really, we wanted a board that wasn't going to come in with potential biases, from law enforcement. It's completely open, if the task force wants to take that out, that's their choice. But that was the reason why it was in there. So people who were former retired, police officers, people who might be married to a police officer, those folks would probably not be, at least the way we contemplated it, would not be eligible to serve.
So let me just turn to the subcommittee members on these points. So Mr. Blanchard, Mr. Battles, Mr. Cordova, Mr. Zaldivar, and Ms. Haben and Krigler. Thumbs up or some other indication if these requirements are okay with you. You might have some amendments or you might want to change something. Task Member Blanchard on this one. So I see thumbs up here. Anybody that wants to suggest any additions or changes? Okay, so we will leave that one.
I note
Oh,
that
sorry.
I really don't agree with the affiliation, just because it's a little bit confusing on my end, because I know a lot of police officers and those that are either children police officers or married to police officers that are very progressive, that would actually love ideas like civilian review boards. So that's my only concern, is that I feel like it may be limiting some people that may bring a positive viewpoint. But I just want to, obviously I'm going to go with whatever the majority decides, but I did want to state that.
What you're saying, I think, is the idea of what makes you a little uncomfortable is the idea of excluding a family member of someone formerly in law enforcement. Is that right?
Correct. I don't mind excluding people who have worked in a law enforcement agency before. I think that's fine. But I think concerning regarding like and maybe a spouse as well, but I think like a family member, I just get confused on the word affiliation when we're talking about law enforcement, because they're affiliated and whether a choice of their own or not. And I just wanted to bring that up.
Councilmember, any thoughts on that?
I think it's something that the task force or subcommittee would need to definitely clarify exactly what your intent is with that particular area.
Chair Krigler.
Well, I'm thinking what it sounds to me is as though it's the immediate family. So yes, it would be if it's the husband or the wife that was actually the police officer, then their significant other, their spouse would not be able to serve. And depending on the children, if they're older, still again, I would think that would be something still yet that they should not be able to serve. But cousin, uncle, aunt, I think that should be fine. I mean, it is, you can't keep going down the line. So, but I think the immediate family would be the one that would be more questionable for me. So.
Co-Chair Cordova.
No, that's understandable. And when we refer to immediate family, some people, or at least most people, will deem the children as immediate family as well. Just from my personal experiences, I have friends that had parents that were in the Elgin Police Department or other police departments throughout the state. And for example, one of my closest friends, her dad actually got fired from the Elgin Police Department for excessive force. And she is probably the most progressive person that I know, way more progressive than me out of all people. And so that's why I bring up that perspective, is that like there are people that are immediate family that have different perspectives than the people who have served in a law enforcement agency. So that's just my perspective again. But I think that my problem, and as I stated, as we talk about this civilian review board, is that the wording is very important with what we incorporate into the foundation of this. And so if the wording is what we need to change to be a little bit more specific and detailed, that's something that we can definitely discuss together as a group.
What I'm hearing is, generally speaking, the idea of avoiding appointments of a law enforcement official or her or his immediate family is something that folks are comfortable with. I want to just check an assumption that I'm making with Councilmember Powell, which is, if, for example, this requirement is written into the ordinance that a law enforcement official and or her or his immediate family can't be appointed, if you were to find some remarkable, stellar appointee who was sort of dinged because of that criteria, I would think by a vote of the council, you could, vote to waive that requirement if there was an exceptional circumstance. Not that you would routinely do so, but that you'd have the prerogative to do so in that unique circumstance. Is that correct?
It depends on how the ordinance is written. It would probably take an ordinance change in order for us to do that. Or if there are some type of exceptions like that that are specifically built into the ordinance.
Okay. And I didn't mean to say that to cloud anything, but just having worked for city council in the past, that's often the way that they treat the, the potential for there to be an exception to a rule that they're making. So that could be a way to address the concern that Co-Chair Cordova is making, which is, well, what about the one situation where a relative is actually a really qualified appointee. So.
And just to clarify again, if it's the language that's the problem, we can easily say those that have now previously or currently working for a law enforcement agency or their spouse. I feel like that's very specific and very clear cut with what we're necessarily agreeing with.
Okay. I'm hearing general consensus on this. We can certainly discuss it again when we go through our recommendations in total, but if it's okay with folks, I think I'll continue. Is that all right? Okay. Want to get to required training. I don't know that this is necessarily something that we need to have a lengthy discussion about. Obviously, there's a lot of technical information. I guess my main thing would be just to ask whether there is anything on this list of required training that gives you pause. Is there anything that's glaringly missing that you think ought to be included? Or does this sound okay to you in terms of required training for Civilian Review Board members? And you can do a thumbs up or whatever you want in terms of. Any comments, team? Shimon, I think, was a thumbs up. Corey, I think, seems okay. Denise, any feedback?
So as I'm looking at this, and I think as, the 1,000 feet above everything, I think this is good. I think when you get down to the nitty gritty of then the implementation, it's like who monitors that training has been done. And, and so that's like in the weeds, that's like the next 2 steps after we do the recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I hear you talk about that feels like the differentiation between policy and the administration of the policy,
Right.
Which isn't to say that you shouldn't make recommendations on it, but it would be sort of the city manager and designees figuring that piece of it.
Well, actually, I think we need to figure it out and hand feed it to the city administration so it doesn't
Okay.
get missed.
Okay. Co-Chair Cordova, then Councilmember Powell.
Necessarily don't see any issues with the training that's being required. I would like to emphasize putting a deadline. For example, 6 months from appointment. I think that's really important because obviously it doesn't matter if they're doing this in their 6th year of 6 years consecutively. So I think that it's important to incorporate 6 months from appointment or a year, depending on how flexible this training could be provided.
Subcommittee members, is that okay with you all to add some sort of timing? Is that okay? Corey, Shimon, LaJewel. Okay. So we'll make note of that to have it be done. Ishmael, do you think 6 months or a year?
I would recommend 6 months. I feel like there should be plenty of flexibility to complete it within that time.
Very well. Councilmember Powell?
Yes, and just to kind of give some context around when we were talking, because this is really important. Obviously, if people are going to be looking at cases and and making a determination on a particular case, they really kind of need to understand some of the policies and procedures, the use of force policies, and Open Meetings Act, a lot of this stuff. So and I think this may have come from some of the other communities that we looked at, and it really made a lot of sense, is that just kind of walking through the selection process. Say there's a recommendation from the council to appoint, people, committee members A through H or whatever. But before you're actually sworn in and officially appointed to the Citizens Review Board, you would have to go through some of these things first. We would put you through the Open Meetings Act training. We would put you through the policies and procedures training, use of force training, the ride-alongs, the firearms training. And the rationale behind some of doing this stuff ahead of time is once you're officially appointed, that body, it becomes an official body and you're subject to Open Meetings Act requirements. So we couldn't do a firearm simulator training with 5 or 10 of the people that were going to serve on the Citizens Review Board together, because that would be considered an open meeting and you would have to post it and all of that stuff, if that makes
Right.
sense.
It does.
So the
So-
idea is that some of these things, we would hopefully come up with some dates and times that work for, several people. We can do them in groups and get a lot of this stuff done within, the first couple of months of putting together the initial review board. Now, the question is, for subsequent appointments, would we have something like that still in place, or would we do something similar to what you all just talked about in terms of appointing people and then giving them a certain period of time to go through the training? But for the initial group of, I think we were looking at potentially 9, at least maybe 9 or so people, not officially appointing them first gives us a little bit more flexibility on doing group training with these people, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. So I think in both cases, you're and Ishmael's, the training needs to happen expeditiously. You're arguing for it to happen even further upstream, I think, which is valid. So let me get my hands. I've got Chair Krigler, then Denise, and then Ishmael.
Okay, I guess I'm just looking at this, and as being a person from the community, I can see the importance to a lot of this information. But then I'm just wondering here, when just normal everyday people are looking at this and they want to serve, they want to participate, but that's a lot of commitment and time for something that I think that they should be able to take and participate in. They're not getting paid for this, am I correct?
Well, and most of the review boards that we saw, I don't think there was any compensation. We don't have compensation for any of our current city boards or commissions.
Mhm.
But again, that is something, if you all feel like you want to incorporate some type of compensation or stipend for these people, by all means, that could be something that comes from the subcommittee.
Yeah, I think that would be something that we definitely need to look at, because that is a lot of time. And a lot of these people are, I'm sure going to be coming from families. They're not going to be just, and they're not going to be people that are, if you want to kind of say, in the education channel of things, of where they're used to going and taking classes and things like that. These are just going to be general people, to
Right.
my understanding, from the community. So
Sure.
this is a
Sure.
lot of requirement.
And I was going to ask you, one possible route is, of course, the idea of providing stipends and or pay. As you look at this, though, are there any pieces of this training that you think feel a little bit superfluous, a little bit unnecessary, or is it more just they do need all this training, but it's a lot to ask of a volunteer?
The one thing that does stick out to me is the participation in community events to provide public education. I'm not understanding or not sure why that one is particularly there. They're there to take and basically judge a situation in reference to an officer committing some sort of an act. So I'm not understanding why that's actually in there. The other training as required, I'd be interested in knowing what else are we asking them to do.
Fair enough.
And then in reference to the overall thing of the EPD, I'm not sure. I guess I'm looking at the act or what the situation was, and then you're given those policies and procedures of what should have been done. But I don't know. This is just kind of like, I'm not comfortable with it at all. I'm not comfortable with it at all. And then
Well,
too,
when you say
I'm wondering,
when you say it, you're not comfortable with which piece?
I'm not comfortable with this, I guess, with this particular whole thing, because my other question more so, have you presented this within community groups, of even asking them if this would be something that they think would be sufficient? Because I guess what I'm really looking at, the same thing like you would be a juror on a jury, you know, it should be something as close to that, that anybody should be able to take and serve on this, you know, without a lot of particulars in there like this, you know.
So I think what I'm hearing you say, and I want you to make sure I'm getting you right, is you want to do all that is able to be done to allow, you know, anyone who has the will to participate and who, you know, meets the reputation for fairness and integrity and a sense of public service and these requirements. You want them to be able to serve. And you're concerned that this level of training is overly burdensome and would leave a lot of people out.
Yes, definitely.
And before I turn to Denise, you made a very important point I just want to underscore regarding community input. This is the kind of thing that we very much would like to ask the community for input on here in the next few weeks. So please know that I've made note of that, and that can be something that we pose to the community directly, as opposed to just assuming we know the community's will on it. So Denise and then Ishmael.
Okay. So one of the things that I see is missing from this training is like, how do you actually do an investigation? And I'm not being facetious in asking that or saying that, because in my experience with having been on the Elgin Human Relations Commission, we were charged with conducting investigations when there were allegations of discrimination. Well, there's nothing worse, I think, than being in a position where you don't know what it is you're supposed to be doing, and, you know, what tools do you have available, and all of those kinds of things. So I'm a great believer that all of those things that are listed around training are very, very important for people to do a good job. I think when people volunteer to do things, it might feel very daunting at first, but at the end result is that you know a lot. You know a lot, you know what it is that you're doing, so then you can make fair and you know, it's not about bringing judgment, but you can make a fair assessment based on criteria, based on facts. So I just say that, but again, to have a training again on what is an investigation process, what does that look like? And then participating in community events, I think is really important, because one of the criticisms that often occur, and I've heard it while we've been meeting as a task force, is that, oh, we didn't know that, you know, X, Y, and Z was happening in the city of Elgin. We didn't know that X, Y, and Z was happening with the Elgin Police Department. So as being on this, you know, review board, we can, you know, be the ambassador to the community. Not we, but the members of the review board can be, you know, promoting the fact that Elgin has a citizens review board.
Sure.
And it's just another, you know, it's another, and I'm not going to say tool in a toolbox, I hate that cliche, but it's another vehicle by which the community can become engaged.
Raise awareness. I think that one of the things I'm wondering as we're having this conversation is, you know, there's other than the ride along, there's nothing in here that specifies how much time all of this training might take or how many of events would be involved. I mean, Councilmember Powell, I would assume that if I'm part of, say, a Kiwanis club or something, and I go to the regular Kiwanis meetings and I make some sort of, public service announcement at those meetings about my work on the CRB, that's part of what you're after in terms of public education, as opposed to having to be part of staging some standalone events to raise awareness. What I'm driving at is, if people are concerned about the onerousness of the training in terms of time, that there could be ways that participation in community events could become just something that a member of the board does at the events they would already be attending, if that makes sense.
I think where the participation in community events came in is kind of piggybacking on existing events in the community, where this group might have a table or a booth, just promoting the fact that we do actually have a civilian review board, what it does, and promoting, if people are having problems or have had problems, the complaint process, and encouraging people to follow that process, and understanding what this civilian review board does. That's what we are looking at in terms of public education.
Sure.
And, if there's other things related to, things in the community related to this, related to things that police department that this board wants to, promote, absolutely they can. I'm not saying that this board is going to become the cheerleader for the police department, because they have their own staff that, participates in community events. But if there are specific things that are taking place that, like I said, we were really just looking for this for board members to, promote the fact that this review board exists and how it operates.
Sure.
And as far as the orientation, the items, if people feel more comfortable, maybe there's a time, hey, that this would only take 2 hours, or this would take 2 hours, or this would take 1 hour, or whatever. I see the 2 hour ride along. But I think the rationale around having people seated with a certain level of understanding of how of what the expectations are of our officers. If they're going to be making judgments about what the expectations are, they really should understand what our policies and procedures are. Obviously, some of that stuff will come up again, and it will be shared with folks again as different cases come up, but just a general overview of all of these things, just to give folks some type of level of understanding, of how of the operations for the police department, and just some of the other training as required, some of the stuff that we want, maybe the the civilian review board is interested in getting a presentation from the county prosecutor's office, or
more of an as requested by the board kind of a situation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or or law changes or something like
Sure.
that.
Sure. Let me interject on a process matter. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and I noticed Dr. Vincent Gattis has joined us from Aurora. Dr. Gattis, thank you very much for coming. Good to have you, sir.
You are most welcome. It's good to see you. Good to see some good friends of mine in here.
And there is no question, Dr. Gattis, who has the finest Zoom background in tonight's meeting. I want to hereby issue the proclamation to you that you are the winner of the Zoom Background Award for the subcommittee.
Can't go wrong with Jimmy, right?
No, you certainly cannot. So, subcommittee members, I want to ask you whether you'd like to. I want to be very respectful of Dr. Gattis's time, of course, and so would folks like a 5-minute break just to use the restroom, check their phone, any of that, and then we'll get into our conversation. I know that there were some hands up in reference to this. I don't want to lose those, but we can come back to it. I just want to try to get to Dr. Gattis as quickly as we can, but if folks would like a break, we can take it. So break or no break? Committee.
No breaks needed for me.
We can just go ahead. I'm fine.
Okay. Anybody?
I'll follow
Shimon,
the
you
break.
okay? Okay,
I'll
no
follow
break.
the break.
Excellent.
And
Well,
I'm okay if you want to take a break. So don't
we
say no
appreciate
break
that.
because
No,
of
no.
me. I'm fine.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Dr. Gaddis.
And
Well, as I
know
say,
you're just celebrating Kansas City, Vince. I know. I was following you.
Yes, we are still celebrating.
I know.
well, as much as I would love to dive into the details of Kansas City's absolutely miraculous victory over the Buffalo Bills the other night, and I say that knowing that I think Dr. Gattis is an ordained minister. I want to introduce you all to Dr. Vincent Gattis, a professor, minister, and community activist, also a public speaker who speaks on present matters, including race and racism, the prison industrial complex, and the question of values in America. Author of a future book entitled Revolution in Values, Why America Must Embrace the Beloved Community. He teaches history at Elgin Community College, and as I mentioned, is, I believe, the chair, is that right, Dr. Gattis, of the Aurora Civilian Review Board, or just a member?
No, I'm not. I'm just a committee member. I am not the chair.
Well, regardless, you are a dignitary in our eyes, and we really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you.
Obviously, I would like the committee members to really dictate the direction we take with this conversation. So allow me just to ask one question to tee things up, and then we'll see what subcommittee members would like to learn from you. I know that the Aurora group is relatively new in the history of civilian review boards. Nevertheless, I would be curious if you would be open to sharing one or two key lessons that you have learned from the time that you've been serving in Aurora that might be instructive for the Elgin group to consider.
Yeah, we have only had, I think our first official meeting was back in September. We got our first case in October. I would say right now, from an internal process point of view, okay, so here would be I'll tell the story and answer your question all at the same time, okay? So lesson one is that when the ordinance was written creating the Civilian Review Board, it was an ordinance. It wasn't a set of bylaws of how we were going to do what we do, right? The procedural matters. So we had to take time to create bylaws for the group, right? To govern how we meet, how we proceed, and then of course there's all of the open meeting stuff, and you know about that. We had to put together a strategic plan. What do we want to do? What are our priorities? The statute says that we hear cases and we report to the public. Well, there's a lot of ways that can happen. And so, and we're supposed to look at the complaint process. So we've had to do a lot of work up front that I don't think that we're all prepared to do, and we did it, right? So we have bylaws. We're getting approved a new complaint form. We created and are putting together a complement form, because police officers should not only be found out when they do wrong, they should also be found out when they do right. So we have put all of that together. We set a calendar to make regular public appearances, town hall meetings, if you will, so out in the community. So yes, we have our meetings every month at City Council, and you can come to the meeting and be bored like the rest of us. But we're putting into our plan at least every quarter to go to different areas in the city, so that residents can come to us, right? And talk about their issues. They could file a complaint right there on the spot if they wanted to. Now, so all of that has been put together in 3 months. So the bylaws, strategic plan, we've heard our first set of cases, all of that has happened. So so on that score, I would say for Elgin, make sure that you're thinking ahead of time of things like bylaws, strategic plan, what is going to be the frequency of this review board's reporting out to the public? How will that be handled, right? Are you only going to speak in public when you say, we got this case, the police department said this should be the punishment, we said this should be the punishment, and this is what the chief said? Is that the only time you talk to the public? Or are there other times when you engage the community and say, talk to us about your relationship with law enforcement, so that we see that as part of our charge, right? Is doing that. So that would be number one, is that pre-work and be thinking about those strategic ideas and implementations.
And let me interject. Let me interject
Sure.
one quick follow-up, Dr. Gattis. Is it fair to assume that you are doing this all as a volunteer, this extensive work that you've been describing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is a volunteer board. Yes, there was early on in the discussion as the ordinance was moving forward, there was discussion of compensation. And I think I think smart discretion says don't put any money in this thing. You know what I'm saying? Give us a budget. Now, we are fighting for a budget, but we're not asking for direct compensation for board members. But the review board should have a budget to be able to produce whatever we want to produce and, that kind of thing. So,
Sure.
no, there's no personal compensation, no.
Understood. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You had a second
Oh,
lesson.
no,
learned you wanted to share.
that's fine. The second point is one that it dovetails with the first, but is an evolving question. And so we don't have the answer to this question yet. And that's this. How exactly are we going to make sure about the complaint process? In other words, the 3653 says, if you make a complaint against the police, you can do it anonymously. Totally fine with that. The big issue, if they don't do that, if people don't do that anonymously or for whatever reason, the issue with complaints run in two levels. One, if I go to the police station and I file an affidavit and I make a complaint, the police have name, address, phone number on record. And I know this would never happen in Elgin, but in Aurora, it has already come. Well, that's the second issue. I'll get to that in a minute. It's already come to several, informally to several board members of people who have complained, but now are getting harassment from the police. So how do you create a complaint process that's totally anonymous and can still be investigated? Because the process is that the police investigate it, then they render a recommendation, then it comes to us, then it goes to the chief. You see what I mean? So the conundrum is, when the Office of Professional Standards, how do we get them the information? I'm sure it's possible, get them information to do their investigation. but how do we make sure that there's no retaliation? Right? That's a big issue, at least for me right now.
It's been mentioned also in our conversations.
Yeah, the second issue is who can take the complaint. I'm going to be bringing this up at our next board meeting, so I don't think this is, telling tales out of school. And we've been talking about this ourselves and how we make sure we amend the complaint process to include this. But let's say that Corey and Denise and Sheila and Shimon are on a civilian review board. Can they take a complaint? Can a citizen go to a member of the board and say, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, and I want to file a complaint? Can they file that complaint with a member of the review board and bypass the police? And then that's one way to protect the person, but we're still back to OPS as the investigators. You see what I mean?
I do.
So this is probably the one of the things that we're still trying to work out and come up with a system, and it's very difficult.
Right.
So from the complaint process, that's something that we need to think very carefully about. Who can like if I'm on the CRB, can I really take someone's complaint? Like if a personal friend calls me and tells me about a complaint and I'm a member of the review board who would down the road be adjudicating or voting on a disciplinary action on that case, can I really take the case? Or is that a conflict of interest, right? I mean,
Sure. I want to also just ask you a question that came up in our discussion a little while ago. Right when you came on, we were talking about training, education requirements. And one of the task force members just made a point that, we need to be sensitive to a balance between making sure civilian review board members have what they need to know to do their work, but also not have a burden level as it relates to time spent on education that would preclude them from serving in the first place because they just can't devote that much time. And so my question to you is more, what do you see as the most vital pieces of information that need to be given in training to a member of a civilian review board as they begin their service?
Let me answer that this way. We went through 17 hours of training with the police department. To be a member of the CRB, you had to go through 17. We did 5 nights or 20 hours, 5 nights, 4 hours a night on 5 different nights, something like that. And that covered everything from, which is, I think, was critical. Right, because let me say it this way, and Chief, we're not going to get into a long discussion about this because we could go on this all night. So be cool. The police's vision of the Fourth Amendment and a Terry stop, and Vince Gattis's vision of the Fourth Amendment and a Terry stop are two totally different worlds apart. But it is important for Vince Gattis to know how do the police think about constitutional law and their jobs? Really important, because that comes down to these things like, when can a person, what is the difference between asking you to do something and commanding you to do something? And where's the line where I can say, I thought the most pivotal question in the CRB training was this question: when can you say no to a police officer? Right? Because there's a moment, like they can stop you. If you're suspected of doing something, they can Terry stop you, but they can't make you do anything. right? But at what point, and in the cases that we've seen, there's a point where you ask me to produce ID or get out of the car. When I haven't done anything, I say no. And now it becomes a command. So now if I say no, somehow I'm resisting. You see what I mean? So the constitutional law piece was huge. The training piece was huge. Going to the training room and running through scenarios where you're the bad guy or you're the officer, and this whole question of when do you discharge your weapon? How can you do, here's the situation, you're in it, what would you do, kind of a thing. The video. So I'm not going to say what's the 1 or 2 or 3 most important points in the training. I'm saying we did like 20 hours of training, and all 20 hours of training were important because you need to be able to see the world the way they see it to understand why they do what they're doing. So I don't think there's a 1 or 2 key training ideas. I think you need to go through a whole process of training to get an understanding from a law enforcement perspective, from understanding of constitutional law to when you make a traffic stop, how do you approach the vehicle? How are you looking in the vehicle? Did you see that gun on the floor in the vehicle? Oh, well, so all of it's important.
Fair enough. No, it's really helpful perspective because that was a key discussion point here just a minute ago. Subcommittee members, I'd like to see if you have specific things you'd like to hear from Dr. Gattis about in reference to the way they're doing things in Aurora. So Mr. Battles, Blanchard, Zaldivar, Cordova, and Ms. Haben and Ms. Krigler. Anything you'd like to ask him? I could talk to you all night, Dr. Gattis, but I'll let
I'm free till 11.
Co-Chair Cordova, go ahead.
Well, one, thank you for providing us that presentation about your civilian review board. I apologize, my internet went out in the middle of the thing, so I heard the beginning and the end, but they were great. My question is if you can talk a little bit about the culture of the Aurora Police Department and the civilians, and see to talk about like what caused you guys to create the civilian review board in the first place.
I'm sorry, say the last part of that.
What caused you to create the civilian review board based on the culture and the engagement?
Yeah. Well, of course, like many parts of the racial reckoning in this country, it all began with George Floyd and the protests that arose from that, and the Aurora Demand Forum, which raised these issues. And the mayor put in place what he called Change Initiative, and change is an acronym for something. I can't remember what it is. And so he did all these listening tours, if you will. Out of that came a discussion about a civilian review board with community leaders, clergy, others. And then it got to the level of saying, yes, we should do this. And then it became a city council issue along with the police department and, activist groups and so on. And so that's how it ultimately came to be. As far as the culture of the Aurora Police Department, I will say it this way. The Aurora Police Department has had a string of what I think great chiefs, in my opinion. Okay, I thought Zeman was trying to get the police department on the right track. I think Keith Cross is going to continue that trajectory, although I think he's a little more reserved than Kristen. I thought Chief Thomas was a great chief who really got the ball rolling on professionalizing the department itself. On the street, there are I think there is still, as professional as the Aurora Police Department has become, there are still officers on the force who have learned policing, let's just call it the old-fashioned way, right? For them, getting muscular is part of the job. You know what I'm saying? And there is a top-down culture of professionalization that I think really has reached many in the department. But there are still officers within the department who I think do not value this kind of professionalization, who believe that power on the street is about my ability to physically dominate you. I think the large majority of the Aurora police force is not that. But the culture is that those officers are covered for, you know what I mean? They're still on the force. And a part of that is the culture of the union. And now don't get me wrong, I am a pro-union guy. Okay, I am for unions. But when a chief says that a person has done something so egregious they should be fired, but the police union can get them a 3-day suspension and back on the street, that's a problem. And so officers who have had many complaints, who come right up to the line, but they don't cross it, they might get a small amount of discipline, but hey, they're right back on the street. You can't get, they're still out there doing what they do. And so this is the part of the culture that I think really has to be addressed and changed from within the department, is that, yes, you can do the professionalization, do the professional training, require more training, but somewhere along the line, when someone, when someone does something so egregious that the chief believes they should be fired and they're back on the job in 3 days, so that's broken. Okay, that's broken.
And I would think, Dr. Gattis, based on my reading, that's national, not limited to Aurora. That
Correct.
notion of,
yeah, I agree.
Arbitrators that circumvent the
Right.
Chair Krigler had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Gattis, for your time. I then have some concerns then in regards to the board and how the police, your reception by those particular police officers that you're speaking of. I mean, do they feel challenged by you all? Do they feel any fear at all that their jobs may be, in jeopardy or anything like that? And then what are you all actually able to do to address those issues,
Yes.
if at all?
Yes. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, that's my concern. And actually, I was one of those that basically had some concerns in regards to all of the training, that's being provided, where they've had all that training and it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. So even with us as the civilian board knowing all of that, does it even matter? Because at this point, from what I'm gathering from your information, who is able to really address them then and address these situations and actually get, if need be, rid of them? People should not have to be treated like that. And more so, especially because it's happening more in especially the Black communities, I know. and then, some of the Hispanic communities, we should be able to be treated like everyone else. And that's kind of my bottom thought of it. Go ahead.
Well, there are two things there, so let me address them one at a time. As far as the reception of the review board and the police, quite frankly, I don't know. I mean, we were embraced by the upper management of the department. The average cop on the beat, I don't know what they think of us. We haven't had the opportunity to fully be who I hope we can be. But I would think that there is almost by definition an adversarial relationship. I hate to say it that way, but I think that's true. That they think that we're not going to take their side automatically. Although, as we've already done a couple of cases, and of use of force complaints, and one of those complaints we recommended termination. Another one of those complaints we found unjustified. So I think we're trying to be fair. I don't know if the average cop in Aurora sees the Civilian Review Board as something that is, we're certainly not a rubber stamp. I know they don't think that. So the average attitude, I don't know. And unfortunately, right now we can't do ride along, so I couldn't tell you because of COVID. The second part of your question is the most intriguing and important part of this, right? The Aurora Civilian Review Board does not have subpoena power. We have access to the city attorney, but we cannot compel people to come and talk to us. We only get the reports as produced by the police. We are not able to independently investigate anything. We only have recommendation authority. We recommend, based on the information that we have, what we think disciplinary action should be. The chief makes the final disposition on all discipline. And then the officer can appeal that to the arbitrator. So from a functional point of view, can the CRB make a recommendation and that's the recommendation that happens? That doesn't exist. We just make a recommendation. What I'm advocating for is that the real power of the Civilian Review Board is our public voice, is to say to the public, we had a case of this an officer, because he can't name names and all that for all kinds of other legal reasons, but Officer X did Y, Z, and A to an individual. We recommended that this person be terminated, and here's why. And the chief decided to only give them 3 days suspension, or the chief decided that they also should be terminated, but they found themselves in arbitration and back on the job, or whatever. In my opinion, the power of the CRB is only the power of public persuasion. The power of speaking truth to the power, speaking truth to the community, and having the community respond to what we're saying to them. But in practical terms, we don't have any power. That's the truth.
Shimon Blanchard, I saw your hand a minute ago. Did you have something?
That was along the lines of my question, is that you say you don't feel like you have any power. Would there be, in your mind, or in your opinion, would there be a body that could be established that would have that power or that voice that you will feel will be more effective?
I didn't catch the second part of that.
That you think would be more effective, sorry.
Oh, no, a way that we think that we could be more effective beyond just our public voice?
Well, I'm sorry, an entity or a body. You said you feel like the CRB doesn't have any power. Do you feel like there, in your opinion, there's an entity or something else that could be established that would have that power that would be that voice?
Well, I would say if you look at it, the issue is about what kind of ordinance do you craft? I think could have crafted an ordinance that says the Civilian Review Board has the ability to do its own independent investigation, can compel testimony of whoever to come and talk to us. And when we render a decision, it should carry equal weight with the chief, or I don't know, whatever, something. Is there another entity within the structure that has more power than we do? No. The power is localized, right? It's at the level of the commander, and the chief, really, and the union. So I think in our case, I think one of the things you should look at, or I would look at, is if you look at the citizens, the Chicago version, they can compel people to come talk to them. They have the power to release tape, right? We don't have that. When they make a recommendation, it's not just, it's seriously considered, right? And so I don't know how to build in more power to the Civilian Review Board. Whatever additional powers we have has to come through the city council. So that's a whole other political fight within the city council of should the CRB have more authority? If so, what should that look like? This is the same battle we had in the early 90s with the reestablishment of the Human Relations Commission, which was an early version of the CRB, but the whole issue of that fight was the issue of subpoena power and the ability to independently investigate these complaints. And at that time, Mayor Stover was like, over my dead body, forget it. It never got off the ground. So I don't know how to give the CRB more power than its public voice, because institutionally, there's a lot of resistance to having this independent board of civilians having as much or more power than the chief in disciplinary decision making. And that's a cultural decision in terms of city government, right? Of what kind of power that they want to allow an independent group of citizens to have over the institutional structure within the city.
Dr. Gattis, I've got two other hands, if you don't mind sticking with us here for just a little bit longer.
I'm free. Come on.
Task Force members, Aldevar, good to see you.
Hi, I just wanted to make some comments to the things that you were saying, Vincent. So I was Dr. Vincent, sorry, I apologize.
Quite all right.
It sounds like to me that you're almost broaching a conversation about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And perhaps that is maybe an approach that we want to go into, you know? And because it sounds like to me that we might be too focused on such a specific function of what we want to see in regards to policing, and perhaps it needs to be and you're right, like maybe if we just focus on policing issues, that's going to affect a very narrow set of people that are going to approach these situations in the first place. And so, I have some people. I know the person in Iowa City that's leading these kinds of efforts right now, and I just wanted to make that comment that it just sounds like perhaps the scope of what we intend to do may be a little bit bigger, and perhaps that's what some of that limitation of power may be coming from. And the city of Elgin doesn't have an equity chair yet, and it sounds like to me that this is something that could be worked with the person who would be hired in that position, as it would entail that close relationship and even an analysis of what is going on in these departments and how different communities are being treated, whether equally or unequally. And go ahead.
No. I'm very struck by this line of the discussion, if only because my firm is meeting with Iowa City as we speak to discuss assisting with their TRC process. And I've written a book about TRCs. So certainly it's of interest to me personally. Dr. Gattis, I want to hear your thoughts on it, but I also have two other hands and want to make sure that everybody gets their chance to ask you some questions, if that's all right. So I'll come back to Task Force Member Zaldivar's point here in just a minute. Councilmember Powell, and then Task Force Member Haben.
Yes, just quickly, and thanks, Dr. Gattis, for being here. Good to see you as always. A question I have, just based on what you said, one of the things that we kind of struggled with is because the framework of what we're looking at and the framework of, I think, all of the other civilian review boards in the state are based on the board making a recommendation and of course the chief having the final say. And that's typically because of, the union contracts. And that's something that would, if the review boards had final discipline authority, that would have to be, that's a mandatory subject of bargaining in the state of Illinois. So that's something that would have to be bargained with the union and achieved through collective bargaining.
Right.
Is that correct, Chief? Did I say that correctly? But my question is, if for the decisions that you all have made so far, the recommendations that you've had on cases, how often have they differed from the ultimate disposition from the chief? And is there something built into your review board that says, hey, if the review board and the chief differ on their recommendations more often than not, then X happens? Is there something to kind of address when the review board and the chief appear to consistently not be on the same page?
Well, let me say first, I need to join you on the beach. But the answer, the answer to the last part of that is no. There is nothing that says that over time, because the first part of your question, we don't know yet. We don't have a large enough sample size. In the cases that we've heard so far, which has only been 2 cases that we've heard so far, our recommendation and the commander recommendations were the same. The chief weighs in at the end, so we don't know what the chief is going to do when we make our recommendation. But in the 2 cases that we've had so far, and so the sample size isn't enough, they were in sync. If there is a significant difference over time between what we recommend and what the chief recommends, there's nothing in the ordinance as I read it that compels either. There's nothing that says that either side has to do anything. There's not there. I don't read that in the ordinance. So I don't know what it would be, but there's nothing in the ordinance that says if there's significant disagreement between what we want and what the chief decides, then X should happen. That's not in the ordinance.
Okay. Now I'll let some folks ask some other questions. And then Larry, if we can just swing back at some point, just for everyone's edification, if you can explain a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation and explain what that is and what it entails, because I don't think everyone
Sure.
understands. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Task Force Member Haben.
You're on mute. You're muted. That's got to be in the dictionary now, right?
I know.
You're muted, you know?
Thank you, Vince. So I just wanted to like sort of piggyback onto what Kevin was saying, and what he captured with that, you know, that kind of a commission on reconciliation captures what I suggested to our task force about doing something around atonement. And so I think that we could do both. We can make recommendations around both. So I don't think, I try never to see the world as an either or, but you know, that we can do all of these things together. And I think that that's about it.
Corey Battles.
Good evening, Dr. Gattis. Quick question. If you can change anything, you know, as far as, you know, the initial setup of the board, what would you probably change if you could now? Knowing what the board is, you know, like your situation and what you're going through, what would you possibly change?
I would want access. We have access to the city attorney. I would like, if I could wave a magic wand, I would want the CRB to be able to investigate independently complaints when warranted, right? If we feel after getting the packet and the information from OPS, if the review board were to say, you know, we really need to speak to A, B, and C persons because we want to have questions for them, I would want us to have that ability. I would want the CRB. I'm just going to be honest with you. On the one hand of my brain says, well, you know, our decision should be the final decision, collective bargaining agreement or whatever, notwithstanding. In other words, that the chief makes a recommendation and then the CRB makes a recommendation. But then the question becomes, does that mean that the CRB's recommendation is the final disposition? Part of my brain says, yes, that's the way it should be.
Right.
Another part of my brain says, well, maybe there should be a kind of negotiation with the chief and the board to say, this is what the final agreement's going to be. But so those would be the things that I would want to change. Most significantly is that we don't have the power to ask anybody any questions. We get, when we dispose of a case, we have in the room the city attorney and the commander. And those are the only people who we can ask questions to. And so I would like to have expanded ability to ask other people questions. And then as far as the final disposition, I'd like the chief to make a decision and then the CRB come out with a decision. Keep our public voice and even amplify our public voice. But I'm torn on who should have the final say on discipline. Should it be the chief or should it be the CRB?
And there was discussion in our meeting, Dr. Gattis, last week, I believe, to say that if the Civilian Review Board had final say, then if an officer objected to the findings of the CRB, that they might file a lawsuit against members of the CRB.
Well, I'm sure that's probably possible.
I just wanted to see if you felt that was a legitimate concern.
I had not in all of our discussions about these issues, that's the first time I've heard that something like that could even be considered. I mean, we're an official commission of the city. So suing us individually, I think, would not be possible. You'd have to sue the city. But I think there's room in there to find a way where the chief and the CRB come to a conclusion, or have the CRB go last and voice it publicly. We think the guy should be fired. Chief thinks they should get 10 days suspension. Let the public know what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's clear that the subcommittee has great interest in the work that you're doing in Aurora, and your time with us tonight has been extremely valuable, Dr. Gattis. I want to thank you for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that it may be that some other questions come up that I communicate with you over via email.
Sure.
But I know that as this discussion continues, we'll probably want to touch bases with you again. So most
Thank you.
Deepest thanks.
Yeah, let me just, before you boot me out of the meeting.
No.
Let me just quickly say this, and then I know you're going to give a whole bunch of background on TRC. I think that's a really powerful idea. Maryland, as a state, is engaged in creating a Truth and Reconciliation Commission right now. The question is, what does broader scope mean? Does a TRC mean that you're going to get the landlords that have been routinely discriminating against African Americans for decades to say their wrongs? I mean, the TRC in South Africa, which is the only one I know in any kind of depth. I know Larry probably knows of others in much more depth than I do, so I'll defer to him. But the issue in the TRC in South Africa was that those who were engaged within the institutional frameworks of power were set, they could come and tell the truth. Now, the other side of that was they were not prosecuted for telling the truth, right? So that's the two sides of this Truth and Reconciliation. Is you're going to hear the truth. Then comes the reconciliation, which from a legal point of view means no criminal charges. Now, I'm going to tell a quick story. I'll be done, Larry, and you can take it. I was in South Africa for the 10th anniversary of Mandela's election. And I was in a coffee shop I was doing some work on leadership in the church and blah, 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 blah. I'm in a coffee shop having a conversation about race with a former member of the South African security forces who was a commander during the Soweto uprising. This man has committed things, unspeakable things. I don't even want to talk about. And we were in a public coffee shop. And he's talking to me about all these things and this issue of race, and he's weeping, and everybody around us has put their coffee down and they're listening and joining in. And because the TRC had happened, he wasn't attacked. They didn't beat him up outside, but the concern of the people in our conversation was, but have you really changed? And they really peppered him on it. And he was telling about how he had changed, and was that true? I mean, I don't know. I'm not there to independently verify, but it led to, I had more significant conversations about race in South Africa with white people in one day than I have had in this country in 58 years of life. Okay. So there is something to be said for creating a true atmosphere where people can tell the truth. Okay, there is something to be said for that, regardless of the fact of whether there's recompense or criminal liability, right? Those are two separate questions. The Evanston thing is quite interesting, right? Which is not a TRC, but a reparations project, right? Which I think is another interesting side of that whole discussion. So, so anyway, if Elgin were to do something like that, man, I would love to be a fly on the wall.
Well, the fact that you just lied about your age, sir, is a criminal offense. I'm sure we're not going to prosecute you for that.
Oh, let me say one last thing, and then I promise I'm done. One of the other things that we are doing or will be doing that I'll be heading up on our board is also I'm going to be launching into a comparative study. So this is very instructive for me because, you know, I want to investigate, you know, Joliet, Aurora, Elgin, Peoria, you know, like similar size cities and see where they fall in all of this, you know, because I think in some ways there's some bad apples on every department. Let's just be honest. But when you see, at least in my opinion, what I have seen through what Chief Lally has been doing, y'all are light years ahead of some other departments that I know of that they're still stuck in whoever's, you know, they're just the blue gang, right? So you guys have made a lot of headway, and that's really important because a lot of people don't really, they can't speak comparatively. My department versus other departments, you know, how does it look? And I think that's an important piece of all this.
Very good. Thank you again.
Thank you. Y'all have a great night.
We shall. Just at the request of Councilmember Powell, I will give a very high-level description of what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is all about. We're talking about a group of lay people, not judges, but civilians who are given the task of investigating something. Now, in South Africa, of course, they were investigating apartheid over decades. In Greensboro, North Carolina, they were investigating a Ku Klux Klan shooting on one particular day at one particular moment in time. And there have been lots of other TRCs that are in between. It most often is examining some sort of an era or some sort of a large-scale issue that has been faced for a number of years. The commission, unlike a courtroom, typically doesn't subpoena anyone to testify. They open their doors and allow anyone who would like to testify, and then they can do so in private or in public in most cases. They can do so anonymously or with their name attached. And many TRCs institute a certain amount of amnesty for those who might be otherwise held criminally responsible for their actions. And usually, as was the case in South Africa, the carrot of amnesty is done in exchange for the stick of you either need to tell us everything you did and take public accountability, or we will prosecute. So even though the baseline of a commission like South Africa's was we're going to promote truth over the traditional criminal justice process and provide amnesty if you come forward, if alleged perpetrators did not come forward or did not give a full accounting, then they could still be prosecuted. TRCs are usually giving reports and recommendations at the end of their work. They, in the case of Canada, for example, made, I think, 94 calls to action, and the federal government in Canada is on track to implement nearly all of them. Their power is mostly political rather than statutory, meaning kind of like we've been talking so far, that they have the ability to have a loud voice. They have the ability to influence people, but they lack the ability to make law or to require someone to come before them. They are usually given a staff that can assist with research, that can assist with coordinating their meetings, and generally operate the TRC, and they function almost more like a board of directors. No two TRCs are the same. Even two TRCs that were both instituted to tackle similar topics will be very different, dependent on funding and dependent on the culture of the place where they're meeting and dependent on the dynamics. The Iowa City Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was referenced earlier is one of probably, I would say, at least a dozen to 24 nationally that are meeting at a local level or at a county level to do some of this work, to examine usually systemic racism writ large, with some of it related to law enforcement, but some of it not, some of it having nothing to do with law enforcement. Their meetings are public, their deliberations are public, their events are public, and they are open. They are not restricted to people called to testify or attorneys representing those people called to testify. So no one is really being put on trial in a traditional way, but they're sort of being tried in the court of public opinion. And they have to make a decision as to whether it's important for them to, come fully clean and hopefully evade, full-scale punishment in the criminal justice system, or whether they want to take their chances and still end up in court. That is probably about 10 years of study in 10 seconds. So I'm happy to talk more about it any time, but they really are a fascinating, construct. Chief, I had intended when Dr. Gattis was finished to ask you for some reactions, because obviously he was presenting a lot of ideas that may or may not, align with some of what you would like to see for the Civilian Review Board in Elgin. Since we're at 5 minutes to 8 and we've been meeting for 2 hours, I'm kind of loath to have a lengthy discussion here, but I do want to, just because you've stuck with us this entire time, just give you a brief opportunity to share any, quick comments you might have about something you heard Dr. Gattis talk about in Aurora that you think might need to be tweaked, for example, in Elgin, if you'd like to do so.
No, I think just his perspective on what happened. I mean, obviously Aurora is different than Elgin. And I think just his perspective on, what they've only had 2 cases. So I don't really think that it gives, like he said, really any data to kind of do the comparison. But I think a lot of what their review board is very similar to the one that Councilwoman Powell and that we had kind of worked on, making some adjustments. I think what was important is, the 20 hours of training that he spoke about. And I think it's important just in the context of understanding what the policy, the procedure, the practical application, seeing what we do. So when things are presented to, to citizens, that they have some framework to work in, which I think is only fair, because you're tasking people with some big decisions, but not giving them the tools to make those decisions. So I think 20 hours to me is, I know it seems tedious, but I think the more that we could give training, again, on people's schedules and fitting it in and not making it too taxing, I think the more the better. But other than that, for the sake of time, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Chief. I'm sorry to be hamstringing you a little bit there. I'm sure you could, wax on for a bit. I want to, first of all, acknowledge Task Force Member Haben and thank you for bringing Dr. Gattis to us. That was, in my opinion, a very meaningful discussion that added a lot of value. So thank you. We are at time, as I said, and so what I'd like to do is just propose a plan for our agenda next week, and that would be to conclude our review of the proposal that we were going through when Dr. Gattis joined us, and that would include discussions of things like duties and responsibilities. I'll just quickly scan the deck here for the public's benefit and for your all's benefit. Duties and responsibilities. We would talk about meeting frequency. We've talked some about the complaint review procedure, but that's something we should revisit, especially in light of the way that Dr. Gattis characterized what he thinks might be best. More on the procedure, recommendation options, reporting requirements, and other items to note. So a good bit left to do, folks, and don't get me wrong, if we need 2 more meetings to get to a place of of final recommendations for this subcommittee, we'll take it. But I want to encourage you all to spend some time on this PowerPoint from Councilmember Powell that's in the box folder, and come prepared to make your recommendations. We also had a suggestion from Task Force Member Flickema that I want to throw your way, and that is, if you have recommendations, you can email them to us, to the facilitation team, and we can prepare them to be placed on the agenda at the next meeting in advance, meaning that when you see the agenda come out, you would see a list of proposed recommendations from your colleagues that you could chew on a bit before the meeting actually starts, because this is a lot. And even 2 hours without a break doesn't give us always enough time to do everything we want to do. So if between now and next Tuesday, you would like to propose any recommendations associated with the proposal from Councilmember Powell that Corey and others have contributed to, please feel free to email me or a member of the facilitation team directly, and we will compile all of those proposed recommendations for next week's agenda. And otherwise, we will just, as I say, go through the other items on the proposal, make sure we touch upon unresolved issues from before, and also touch upon any other task force comments that were made when this was first presented to the full task force. So is there anything else for the good of the subcommittee before we adjourn? Also, thanks to Task Force Member Blanchard for turning the lights out at City Hall. I assume you'll take care of that, sir. But thank you for being at City Hall for us. And of course, Chief, thanks for working overtime for us. Anything else for the subcommittee? Then we stand adjourned at 8. You all have a good night and a good week. Thank you very much for your effort. Take care.
Bye.